Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to deliver kind of a final verdict on the Canon EOS 5D SR. And I've already dealt with this camera in a couple of previous episodes. In the first episode that you can see here, we took a look at the overall build, the design, the specifications, kind of the general handling of the camera itself. And in that episode, you come to the conclusion that in essence, this is a Canon 5D Mark III overall body and casing with almost identical button placement and overall ergonomics, with a few changes that are really designed around enhancing that big 50.6 megapixel amount of resolution that's in the 5DS and the 5DSR. And so that includes some reinforcement on this bottom plate, and so that the tripod mount is even more stable. And internally, there are some revisions to the way that the shutter and the mirror mechanism works that are designed around not only making it quiet, that it is more quiet and maybe smooth in operation, but it's really more about reducing vibration as much as possible. And on the software side, there are some additional settings for programming when it comes to your shutter release, and so that you can kind of set it up to optimize having as little vibration as possible. That is, of course, because any kind of vibration is going to be kind of magnified or more evident on very large megapixel images like those of the 5DSR. A large amount of megapixels doesn't create motion blur, but it does emphasize it because of the sheer amount of pixels that are there. And so most of the physical changes are around that. With the exception, one other physical change is that on this side, instead of the USB 2.0 output that there was on the 5D Mark III, there is now a USB 3.0. And so, of course, that's positive in the sense that the sheer amount of data that you may need to transfer off the camera, it means that you can get higher transfer rates. The downside to that is that it necessitated the removal of the headphone jack for video recording and monitoring. And so in that sense, this camera takes a bit of a step back from the 5D Mark III, although it does add a movie servo AF to where it autofocuses during video capture. I will say, however, if you're accustomed to any camera that uses Canon's DP-AF, like a 70D, an 80D, or a 7D Mark II, or in particular the new 1DX Mark II, you're going to be disappointed with the implementation here. It's just not as sophisticated as what it is in those cameras. But of course, something is better than nothing. And so overall, physically, it's very, very similar. So much so that you can share things like underwater housing or battery grips. Those things can be shared with the 5D Mark III. It does have the new LPE6N battery pack like some of the other new Canon cameras, but all of those are also backwards compatible with the LPE6 that was used in the 5D Mark III or the 6D and a variety of other bodies. And so you can still use your extra battery packs in this camera as well. The LPE6N just has a little bit better transfer rate for certain situations. It may help, but I think that's probably truer in the cameras that have a higher burst rate than what this camera does. Speaking of burst rate, that brings us to a second consideration, and that is when it comes to the autofocus system. Once again, the autofocus system is largely inherited from the 5D Mark III. It has the same 61 AF point system, and it has, for the most part, the same kind of customizable programming, different cases that you can choose depending on your autofocus situation. That's not a bad thing, because the 5D Mark III has one of the best autofocus systems that's ever been seen in a camera, really, and it's a very tried and true system that is still beloved 4 years after the release of the 5D Mark III. It is slightly upgraded here in that it also now has the more sophisticated zone metering of the 7D Mark II that's kind of implemented in here. And so that helps with things like face tracking. And so particularly if you're doing AF servo type tracking, the AF system in the 5DS or the 5DSR is actually a little better or a little more sophisticated than that of the 5D Mark III. And of course, the byproduct of that also is that the metering is a little bit more accurate in this camera as well. And so the bottom line is it has an exceptional autofocus system. It just works really, really well, and I've enjoyed using the 5DSR in that regard. It's good in AF servo mode, it's good in one-shot mode. It just gets the job done. And of course, you have a lot of different options in terms of selecting zones or groups or single points supported by others or just single points altogether. It gives you a lot of different flexibility on how you're going to compose, and thus gives you confidence of being able, for the most part, to have an autofocus point where you want. If there's anything that I would wish for in a new system down the road, is that the AF point spread might be just a little bit bigger, and so that you have obviously a lot of AF points here, but being able to have them cover just a little bit more of the frame would be advantageous in my opinion. But really, the autofocus system is excellent. And while the nature of the camera makes it seem like a less obvious choice for sports or wildlife shooting, and I'll get to that in just a second, it's not because that the AF system can't keep up. If you can do it in the 5D Mark III, you can do it even a bit better in the 5DS or the 5DSR. Where the 5DS or 5DSR takes a little bit of a step back is when it comes to the overall frames per second, which instead of 6 frames per second, it is now 5 frames per second, which is still pretty impressive when you consider that the 5DS or 5DSR, this camera is moving more than twice the amount of data through the pipeline that the 5D Mark III is. And so really, the fact that it's only 1 frame per second slower is a very good performance in that regard. And so it's actually got 2 Digic 6 processors to help to cope with all of that data that's moving through. But where it falls a little bit further back is in the amount of buffering that it has. And in other words, how many shots you can shoot before the camera has to pause to unload the buffer. Like the 5D Mark III, it has dual slots. One is a CF card, the other is for an SD card. The advantage here is that the SD card slot supports the latest codecs, and so you can actually put SD cards in there that are fast enough to compete with basically any of the CF cards that you could use also. And so, but either way, and I've tested it using CF cards or with the latest SD cards, you're going to find that after about 14 raw images, that's my experience, basically dead on. After 14 raw images, the camera starts to slow and might take a frame or 2 more at a much slower burst rate, and then it will need some time to flush out the buffer. That's true if I shot in full raw mode. Some of you have asked if you were to throttle the settings down to, say, medium raw mode. At medium raw mode, I still got 14 frames before it needed to unload the buffer, and at the smallest setting, the SRAW setting, I was able to get 16 frames before it needed to unload the buffer. The SRAW setting is at 12 megapixels. So the only real advantage that I saw in stopping that down or going to a lower resolution setting is that it did take a little less time for the buffer to clear afterward. But the bottom line is you're going to get about 5 frames per second, and you're going to get about 14 images, raw images, before the buffer fills up and needs to be flushed out. Now, it's a little bit rosier a picture when you look at the JPEG settings, because while the frames per second isn't any faster, the buffer is basically just the size of your card. So you can shoot until you run out of space on your image card, and so that's great in that regard. But when it comes to shooting raw images, the buffer is only really about half that what of the 5D Mark III is, and so that means that this camera is not going to be a top pick for those of you that need to shoot sports, or even if you need to shoot wildlife in the sense of birding or something like that, where you need to just get as many shots as possible in a limited amount of time. You'd be better off with either, the top-end cameras like 1DX or even a 7D Mark II, which is going to give you a much better frames per second rate. Now this camera will autofocus at f8, say I tried it with the 100 to 400 millimeter Mark II lens with the 1.4x teleconverter, but just note that it autofocuses just fine, but it will only basically either allow you to shoot the center point or the center point surrounded by the 4 surrounding points to reinforce that, but you can't move out to either side. And so it's much more limited in that sense than, say, the new Canon 80D when it comes to shooting with f8 maximum aperture combinations. Now, in another episode, we looked at both the pros and the cons of having 50 megapixels. And so I won't go deeply into that right now. I would encourage you to take a look at that because I really break down image quality overall and try to examine the upside and the downside of 50 megapixels. But to summarize those things, obviously, all the files are much, much larger out of this camera if you're shooting at 50 megapixels. So just know that that's going to cost you all across the pipeline. You're going to need more storage space. You very likely will find that your workstation that wasn't chugging along before, it will start to chug at times when processing or rendering. So working with these files does come with additional challenges, and so I think that probably should be understood. I've already mentioned that motion blur is going to be more exaggerated. You should also know that this camera kind of underperforms compared to the 5D Mark III and the 6D when it comes to its noise in the images and high ISO performance. Its native range is only ISO 100 to 6400, and you can expand that to ISO 12800. That compares to the 5D and Mark III, who have a native range of 100 to 25,600 and expandable up to 100,000 plus. And so just know that your native ISO range is more limited, and you're going to start to see noise a lot sooner with this because of the pixel density than what you are with the 5D Mark III, and even more so compared to the 6D, which has a kind of a cleaner sensor overall when it comes to noise and high ISO performance. And so you certainly see the noise, and it feels like a step back to me in that sense. Now there are ways to minimize that. You can downsample your images to smaller resolution sizes, and that helps to reduce the appearance of the noise, and that's also true, by the way, of motion blur. And so there are steps in post-processing that you can take, but if you're someone that just wants to be shooting JPEGs, you're going to find that this camera is a little bit more limited in shooting maybe events or in low-light venues. It may not be your best choice for that. But beyond that, the upside, of course, is that there's a huge amount of applications for that massive amount of resolution. And ironically, it can even make poorer lenses, although on one hand, it punishes poor lenses because it will exaggerate their flaws. At the same time, with, again, appropriate post-processing, it can actually make lower resolution lenses look higher resolution just because of the sheer amount of pixels that you can use. And so it's impressive in a number of ways when it comes to that. And the ability you have to deeply crop in images and still retain a huge amount of information is hugely beneficial for a lot of settings. And I find that it's really, like I've shot portrait sessions and groups, and then also some event stuff as well. But I find that when I'm shooting a group, it enables me to, let's say you're using, I'll give you this example, if you're shooting a lens that may distort some on the sides, but before you might want to fit as much in the frame as, or kind of frame as tightly as possible because you don't want to lose the resolution. With the 5DS-R, you can just go ahead and shoot a little bit wider and crop off the distortion edges because there's so much resolution left in the middle that it's great for that. You can pull individual faces easily out of group shots, say for like sports shots. It's very, very impressive in that regard. And for landscape, there's just the ability to deeply crop and still have a credible image is very useful in wildlife. You're able to, again, deeply crop and get closer to your subject in a very credible way. And so there's a lot of flexibility in that. And after having used the crop modes here, you can set up crop mode for APS-H and then also APS-C. APS-H is 1.3 times crop, APS-C is 1.6 times crop. While those things have their usefulness, I personally prefer to just crop in post. The way that it's implemented, and you can see more about that in my written review below. I really kind of detail how that works. I prefer to just crop in post, but your mileage may vary. But certainly having that massive amount of resolution is very useful in any number of settings. Ironically, what makes this camera a little more tempting to me is the fact that you can actually throttle back that resolution. I like the fact of having it on tap for the moments that I need it, but I'm not interested in shooting at 50 megapixels all the time. But I do find that the medium raw setting of 28 megapixels is very, very useful, and there's a lot of applications for that, and that's kind of become my go-to setting with this. It's still far more resolution than what I'm getting out of my other bodies, while being at a more manageable level in terms of the file size and working with them in post. There's also an SRAW setting at 12 megapixels, which of course is still also very useful for other applications when you don't need such a massive amount of resolution. There's also far more options in shooting in JPEG mode than what I've seen before, including some very useful medium JPEG settings that will give you options, both of which are very, very useful. And one of those, the M1 setting, is 39 megapixels, while the M2 setting is 22 megapixels. And so both of those are obviously very useful JPEG settings for that. And so the ability to have the higher resolution on tap for those kind of rare situations where it's warranted, but at the same time to have an extremely competent camera that really does most things quite well. Great autofocus, great image quality, okay higher ISO or noise levels, but you can make them look fantastic with some work. But being able to shoot that at, say, 28 megapixels, I find very, very useful. And that's kind of where I've been living with this. And so it makes it more tempting to me. But at the end of the day, here's my conclusion. Really, the reason why you buy this camera is because you need, at least on occasion, 50 megapixels. If you don't really need 50 megapixels, and I'll be very honest, I have never, in all of my years of shooting professionally, I've never had a client say to me yet, wow, I like your work, but these file sizes are just not big enough. These images are just not high resolution enough. The reality is that the amount of resolution that comes out of your average DSLR these days is overkill already for most applications, and so 50 megapixels, doubling that, is even more overkill for most applications. Now, if you're someone that shoots big and prints out big fine art prints, hey, this is your camera. If you are shooting model photography, or your work is going to be used in commercial advertising or billboards, obviously this is killer. If you're a landscape photographer that wants massive amounts of resolution, this is your guy. But if you don't need that kind of resolution, then your money might be wasted on the 5DSR. It's really not a more competent camera than the 5D Mark III, and in some ways it's a step back. And of course, it seems like the 5D Mark IV is right around the corner. I'm tempted to have one of these, but not as my primary body. In fact, maybe not even as my everyday body. I would like to have one for the situations where I feel like I need it, but for the most part, I find that the 22 to 24 megapixel range suits my purposes quite admirably most of the time. But if you're looking for extreme high resolution and fantastic image quality, I definitely recommend the 5DSR, but only if you need those 50 megapixels. I'm Dustin Abbott. If you look below, there's linkage to my full written review that has a lot of image samples, also to an image gallery with a variety of lenses taken with the 5DSR. You can also follow me on social media, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. Have a great day.